Thank you. Thank you all for coming on this rainy day. How nice to see such a crowded room. People who are standing, if you want to sit, I think there's a chair here, and we could pull up a chair, but if you want to stand, that's fine with you. That's fine. So, does everybody have a copy of the handout that I've been kind of giving out as people come in? But the handout on the front page is an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I always find it helpful so you can see how the argument is going to progress, and you can see where I'm going and where I've come from. The back page is there so that you will know that I'm a college professor. So I'm an evolutionary psychologist, which means that I'm interested in human nature. I'm interested in how our human nature came about by natural selection. And as Antonio said, over the last 20 years or so, actually somewhat longer than that, I've been particularly interested in the nature of human children, and most particularly in those aspects of children's nature that serve the function of their education. And if you think of the characteristics of childhood, sort of the things that first come to mind, curiosity, playfulness, their willfulness, I argue that these characteristics were shaped by natural selection to serve the function of education. Unfortunately, in our standard schools, we shut these things off, and then we try to educate them by reward and punishment, rather than by taking advantage of the fact that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves. So I'm going to be talking about that biological design of children to educate themselves. So on the handout, I start with I should get my notes out, because if I speak without my notes, I end up getting on to a tangent, and I'll keep you here forever. So A on the handout is, what is self-directed education? So to begin, I have to say, well, what is education? Education is a term that we kind of misuse in our society, I think. If I asked you how much education have you had, you would answer in terms of how many years of school you've had, or what kind of diploma you've had. And for any really meaningful definition of education that has to do with actual life, that has to do with human nature and human history, that's a pretty inadequate definition of education. So I've defined education. There's different ways I define it for different contexts, but generally speaking, when I'm speaking with parents and teachers and so on, I define education, as I have here, as the sum of everything a person learns that enables that person to live a satisfying and meaningful life. So by that definition, education is a good thing. It's what you learn that allows you to live a satisfying and meaningful life. And we all need education. We don't need school, but we all need education. And we have needed education for hundreds of thousands of years. For as long as we have been human beings, we have been the animal that depends upon education for our survival. We depend upon learning certain kinds of skills and certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of values that allow us not only to do those things that human beings everywhere have to do, like walk on two legs and speak their native language and control their emotions and know how to get along with other people, but also to do those things that are culture specific. So if you're growing up in a hunter-gatherer tribe, how to track game and how to find roots and how to build dugout canoes and so on. If you're growing up in our culture, how to read, how to write, how to use numbers, how to use computers, how to drive a car. Every culture has certain kinds of culture-specific skills that if you're going to live a meaningful and satisfying life in that culture, you kind of need to learn them. And my argument is that children come into the world designed to learn those things too. They're designed to look around and see what it is that people in this world that I'm growing up in do, and seem naturally to gravitate to learning those kinds of things. In addition to that, of course, especially in our very rich culture, there are all kinds of different pathways, different things that are important maybe to you for your satisfying and meaningful life, but are not important to me. And there are some things that are important to me. So we all have different, so there's certain species-specific things that we all are inclined to learn. There's certain culture-specific things. As long as we're in this culture, we all are kind of inclined to learn those things. But then there's a whole world of individual things that makes our culture so rich that you might be fascinated by everything. You want to know everything you can possibly learn about European history or about downhill skiing, and I maybe want to learn everything I can about how the brain works and so on. Somehow we get engaged with different kinds of interests, and sometimes we get a little snobby and we think, well, this is fascinating to me and it ought to be fascinating to everybody else, and then we think we should try to make everybody else learn what we find interesting. But in self-directed education, we acknowledge that we all have our own path. We all create our own meaningful life that we are trying to live. And my meaningful life is not the same as your meaningful life. So self-directed education, so education is defined that way. Self-directed education then is education that derives from the self-chosen activities and life experiences of the person being educated, whether or not those activities were deliberately done for the purpose of education. Most self-directed education isn't the case that you're setting out, okay, I'm educating myself, I'm going to go out and educate myself. Most of it just comes in the process of life. You're pursuing your interests, you're playing, you're exploring, you're solving problems that come up in life and you're trying to solve them. And in the process of doing all that, you're learning all this stuff that then prepares you for the future, for the future that you are carving out for yourself. Self-directed education necessarily leads different people along different paths. There are certain things, as I said, that we all are inclined to want to learn, but there are many other things that we have different paths that we want to learn those things. So self-directed education can be contrasted with imposed schooling. So imposed schooling is schooling that a person is required to engage in. Imposed is a better term, it's sort of a less pejorative term than forced schooling, but it means the same thing. Forced schooling or coerced schooling, what most children in this country are, and throughout the world, in developed countries, are required to do. To go to school because the law says they have to go to school, and or at least people interpret it as the law saying that they have to go to school. And instead of following their own interests, they're doing what they're told to do, and they are following a curriculum that is imposed upon them. Their own questions don't count, it's the questions of the curriculum that count. So that's the distinction between. Now, I would argue that no matter how much schooling you've had, most of your education has been self-directed education. You know, I've been in school all my life, and yet most of my education is self-directed education. It doesn't come from any imposition. Most of the stuff I learned because I had to take courses that I didn't necessarily want to take, I've forgotten anyway, and that's true for essentially everybody in our culture. The things that you remember, the things that really help you live a meaningful and satisfying life, are the things that truly engaged you as you went along, where you were taking the initiative about this, where you were doing this, where you were engaging with the material, and you weren't doing it because somebody was rewarding you for doing it or punishing you for not doing it. Reward and punishment, the kind of education that occurs in school, creates a very shallow kind of learning that allows you learn to pass tests, and then you kind of learn to empty your mind after the test and then go on and fill it up for the next test and so on. There's a lot, think of the amount of time and effort that's just wasted in kind of this jumping through hoops sort of process. So now the next term I have on this handout is self-directed education with capital letters. I'm going to say a little bit at the end of this talk about the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, and we kind of have coined this term, self-directed education, as a brand with capital letters And what we mean by that is you're pursuing self-directed education if you have made the deliberate choice to pursue self-directed education rather than imposed schooling. So those people who are doing self-directed education very consciously, I'm choosing to go to a place like Abrome or Clearview or an agile learning center, or I'm choosing to do homeschooling, but homeschooling of the type that's called unschooling, where there's no imposed curriculum. People who are doing that we're calling self-directed education. We want this to become sort of a brand. We want people to be who are pursuing this kind of route and whose children are pursuing it, to be able to say very proudly to their neighbors, if they ask you, so where do your kids go to school? You say, we do self-directed education. And that leads to sort of questions. Well, what is self-directed education? It leads to an interesting conversation. I think that's more positive than if you say we're doing unschooling. That sounds like you're not educating your children, right? It sounds like it tells what you're rejecting, but it doesn't tell what you're embracing. So by saying we do self-directed education, you're saying, yeah, we are into education, just like you are, but this is how we do it. And we would like to see self-directed education become sort of a household term in the same way that Montessori education is, or any other kind, so that when people hear about somebody doing this, it doesn't sound so strange anymore. One of the big barriers for people doing this is that it sounds strange to other people. It's very hard for us to do things that other people think are strange, even if we think it's the right thing to do. It's very hard to do because we have to constantly justify it to other people. All right, enough with that terminology. Let me go on to B here, nature's design for self-directed education. So when I say that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves, what do I mean? What I really mean is that they come into the world with a set of natural drives or instincts, whatever you want to call them, that were shaped over the course of human history for the purpose of education. These drives exist in other mammals as well, but in our young children, these drives become stronger. They become more oriented towards learning a larger variety of kinds of things than occurs in other mammals. So I've listed here what I think sort of what some of these drives are, and there's no mystery to them. Curiosity. Aristotle, in the first sentence in his famous Metaphysica, his treatise on the origin of knowledge, the first sentence was, human beings are naturally curious about things. Nothing could be truer than that. Newborn babies, they come out of the womb already exploring. The first thing, there's actually research studies that when babies are like 2 or 3 hours old and they can just sort of barely focus their eyes, and you show them some kind of a pattern, and then they've already seen this pattern, and now you give them a choice between looking at that pattern and a new pattern, and they spend more time looking at the new pattern than the old one. They're already saying, what's new out there? I got that pattern kind of. What's this one over here? And as soon as they become mobile, what are they using their mobility for? They're using it to explore. They're going, they're trying to they're kind of first getting things into their mouth to explore it that way, then they're manipulating it with their hands. You can't leave anything out that's breakable because they'll break it, because they want to see what happens if you drop it on the floor. They're exploring the world. You can't stop them from exploring the world unless you shut them away in a closet. And this drive to explore, this doesn't just occur in babies. As children get older and as they become more mobile, they're exploring larger and larger parts of the world. They're exploring the physical world. They're exploring the social world. They're experimenting with how they can please you and annoy you and get what they need from you, and so on and so forth. They are little physicists. They're little psychologists. They are just naturally, and it's not surprising. They wouldn't think of what human beings have to learn. We would not have survived as a species were it not for the case that children come into the world with this driving curiosity, and they're especially interested in what they can do with things. They want to figure out what they can do with something. And you give them any kind of a toy, and they try to figure out what are the properties of this toy that allow me to do something interesting with it. So that's curiosity. Playfulness. So curiosity is the drive that leads to knowledge, leads to understanding, leads to kind of developing of theories about how things work, and so on and so forth. Playfulness is the drive that leads to skills. Playfulness has to do with practicing skills. Think of all of the different ways that children play. And when in our culture, unfortunately, more than almost any other culture in the world, more than almost any culture in the history of the world, as far as we can tell, we deprive our children of play. The only other cases where children have less opportunity to play, when I talk to anthropologists, they confirm this, are situations of childhood slavery, or when children were working 7 days a week, 14 hours a day in factories and so on, or coal mines. Or in other situations, whether you're looking at traditional societies, children are playing huge numbers of hours every day. They're playing. And when children are free to play, and by play, I mean really play, not do stuff that's directed by adults. I'm not counting Little League baseball or karate lessons or any of that stuff as play. That's not play. That's more school. So play is where children are creating their own activities, largely with other children. And in most parts of the world, and even in this part of the world, when I was a kid, the great bulk of play was away from adults, no adults around. And children in play are practicing being adults, and they can only practice being adults if there's no real adults around, because otherwise adults step in and they act the adult part and prevent the child from learning the kinds of things that children are designed to learn through play. But think of here, I've made a list of things, different ways that children play. And where children have ample time to play, most children play in all of these ways. So they play physically. Like other animals, we have physical bodies. This is the kind of play that we most clearly share with all other mammals. We play at chasing one another around, at climbing trees, at leaping, at running, at fighting, all these kinds of things that we play at. That this is how children are designed to build their bodies. They're not designed to lift weights or run around tracks or swim back and forth laps in a pool. They're designed to chase one another around, screaming and laughing until their sides are splitting. And this is how all over the world children get in shape. This is how all over the world children develop strong bodies and strong bones and graceful movements. Children also play in risky ways as part of their physical play. And this is true of other mammals as well. And it has been intriguing to evolutionary psychologists. Why do mammals play in these risky ways? Our children, they climb trees too high. They in a playground, they go up the slide and do it in ways that look, if a parent sees it, wants to stop them because they might fall. Other animals do the same kind of thing. Chimpanzees, young chimpanzees have been observed climbing the top of a tree and then dropping and then catching themselves just before they hit the ground. And why do goat kids leap along cliffs where monkeys chase one another around in trees high enough up and far enough apart, the branches, that they could fall. And if they fell, they wouldn't probably kill themselves. They're not that high up, but they would hurt themselves. So why didn't natural selection weed at least that kind of play out? That seems like would be harmful play. And the answer that animal behaviorists have come up with is, I think, a brilliant one, and I think it applies to human play just as well. Why our children want to play in risky ways when we allow them to do so. All of us in life, all of us mammals in life, are going to face real emergencies at some points in our life. And if we haven't experienced fear, if we haven't practiced controlling our mind and our body while being in a dangerous situation, then when we face that real world dangerous situation, we might panic. We might not be able to control ourselves. We won't know what to do. We will feel lost. And we might therefore die or we might fail to save our own children or to save somebody else's life because we have panicked. So the ability to control yourself in fear, to regulate your fear, seems to be the reason that children are playing this way. It's almost like they're titrating fear. How high can I go in that tree without, and still feel that, yes, I'm still in control, and now I can come down. If I went one more step up, I would begin to panic. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go that high. I know I can do this. And then you come down and think of, imagine that little girl who's climbed that tree higher this time than she did before, and what a sense of confidence and satisfaction she has when she comes down. I did that. I went that high in that tree, and I lived to tell the tale. And so that little girl is going to be much less likely to have a panic attack at some point when there's a real emergency in fear, because she has developed the confidence that she can control her mind and her body in that state. And when we deprive our children of that kind of play, we're depriving them really of the ability to develop courage. That's what animals and human children are developing when they play that way. Children play with language. So now these are ways that I've just described that we share with other animals. I should probably go a little bit faster. I'll never get through this handout, but we learn language in play. Nobody teaches children their native language. Children learn their native language by hearing it, the first cooing and babbling of infants is always when the child is in a playful and happy mood. The first words are always used in a playful way. They're never used to seriously ask for anything. They're always used, and if you watch children as they're growing older, they begin to play with the language. They play with the structure of the language. There are actually dissertations done on what's called crib talk. So young children who are talking to themselves, and they sound like little poets. They're sort of saying the same thing over and over again, but varying how they say it, and they're kind of turning the grammar inside out, and they're asking the same question but with a different object of the question each time. It's as if they're rehearsing different ways of speaking, and they really are doing that. And when they're with other kids, as they get a little older, they engage in rhymes and alliteration and riddles. A lot of play, social play, is verbal play. And even when the play is basically something else, they're communicating verbally all the time and developing language. There are studies that show that with young children, their language is much more complex in play when they're just talking with other kids than it is in the classroom. And it's much more complex than it is even when they're talking with their parents or when they're talking with other adults. Why? Because in the context of play, they are engaged in it. They really have to communicate. They have to get the point across, and they engage in discussions, negotiation, arguments, and so on and so forth. It's really meaningful to them. And so play is how children develop linguistic capacities. They play, children, however else they play, want to play socially. Solo play, just playing by yourself, is almost kind of unique to Western modern culture because we isolate children so much from other children. But throughout history and throughout most of the non-Western world, children were always a lot of other kids around. And that was true also when I was a kid in this culture. And so the great bulk of play is social play. Regardless of what else you're doing in play, you're playing socially. No surprise from an evolutionary point of view, because I think it's clear that one of the most important things we all have to learn, arguably the most important thing, is how to get along with other people. We're a species that can't survive without other people. We can't survive without being able to make friends, we certainly can't reproduce without being able to attract a mate. Being able to get along with other people is way more important than knowing how to read. Way more important than knowing how to add or subtract or multiply numbers. You can live a happy life without those things. There are people who have true dyslexia. It's rare, but there is such a thing as true dyslexia, who never learn how to read, and they're fine. But if you can't get along with other people, you can't have a happy marriage, you can't have real friends, you can't have good work partners. You really can't have a happy life if you can't do that. So no surprise that children are playing socially, and when they're playing socially away from adults, they're learning how to negotiate, how to get along with equals, get along with peers, because no adult is there saying, oh, stop that bullying or stop that teasing, because the kids then have to figure it out. They have to figure out how they're going to solve this problem. They're learning how to do it. So in every culture, children play games with rules. I would argue in the talk that I'm going to give in the library, this all about play, I will argue that all play involves rules, but most play involves implicit rules. The rules aren't necessarily stated, but they're understood. But in every culture, there are games with explicit rules, where the rules are clearly stated. In our culture, these tend to be competitive games, like baseball or Candyland or chess or soccer or whatever. They tend to be competitive games, and we see the rules as sort of making the competition even. Everybody has to follow the same rules, otherwise it wouldn't be fair. But hunter-gatherer cultures also have games with rules, and they're not a non-competitive culture, and their games are not competitive. Their games are all cooperative, but you're cooperating within a set of rules. Maybe the object is to keep the ball in the air, but you have to do it. There are certain ways that you hit the ball, and so on and so forth. So we are the animal that has to live by rules. Every culture, people everywhere have to follow rules. Explicit rules as well as implicit rules. And so it's no surprise that nature designed children to practice following rules. And the way that practice occurs is children play at games with rules. Children, the basic art, the way the human thinking, the fundamental difference between our thought processes and that of other animals is we are capable of imagination. We can think about things that aren't there. We can think about things that never existed. We can think about tomorrow, even though tomorrow hasn't come. All of what we think of as higher order thinking, the ability to develop hypotheses and so on, involves imagination. And children are constantly practicing imagination in play. Little children who are playing fantasy games, so there's a troll under the bridge, and what are the consequences of the fact that there's a troll under the bridge? Or if we're playing house and I'm the mommy, or I'm the daddy and you're the mommy and you're the baby and you're the pet dog, what does that mean in terms of how you have to act? So children are constantly carrying out, they're saying, okay, they're posing, they're doing what scientists do. They're posing, all right, if this, let's take this as our axiom. There's a troll under the bridge. And if this is our axiom, what are the consequences of that? What does that mean in terms of how we have to behave? They don't articulate it that way, but that's essentially what children are practicing. They're practicing what cognitive scientists would call hypothetical thinking, which is the kind of thinking that we all engage in when we're involved in any kind of thinking about things that don't actually exist in our immediate presence. So children play with logic, as I've just described. Children all over the world play at building things. What they build depends upon what culture they're in, but we are the animal that with opposable thumbs. We're the animal that has always survived by, in some sense, building our environment. We build shelters, we build means of conveyance, we build tools, we build, and this has been true for as long as we have been human beings. And so no surprise that children come into the world biologically designed to practice building things in play. And so we have what's called constructive play. And again, it varies by culture. Children in hunter-gatherer cultures build the musical instruments similar to the kind that they're used in the culture. They might build tug-out canoes, they might build bows and arrows, and so on and so forth. And children in our culture might build constructions with wood, or they might build computer programs. They might build, so building constructive play can be something that's not necessarily manual. It can even be visual. It can be a piece of art, and so on. So and children play naturally with the tools of the culture. Anthropologists report that in every culture, children are drawn to the tools of that culture. So I've done some research interviewing and surveying anthropologists who've studied hunter-gatherer cultures, and hunter-gatherer kids are just drawn to bows and arrows, if it's a culture that uses bows and arrows, blowpipes and darts, if it's a culture that uses that, to digging sticks, to dugout canoes, if it's a culture that uses that, and the children naturally gravitate to that. All hunter-gatherer kids are drawn to fire, and they play with fire. They play, even little kids, 2-year-olds play with fire, and they play with knives and so on, and the parents understand that this is how children learn how to do things. In our culture, what's the main tool of our culture? Unquestionably, today, the main tool of our culture is the computer. So no surprise that just as hunter-gatherer children are drawn to fire and bows and arrows, the primary tools of their culture, our children are drawn to computers as clearly the primary tool. No matter what they're going to do, any child whose eyes are open can see that no matter what you're going to do in this culture, you're likely going to have to be good at computers. So, of course, they're drawn to computers. So that's just kind of a rundown of what the different ways that children are playing and all the things that they're learning as they're playing. These different ways of playing overlap. You can be playing with computers at the same time that you're playing an imaginative game, at the same time that it's also a social game, at the same time that you're exercising linguistic skills, and so on and so forth. The third drive that I've listed here is sociability. We humans are not only the most curious and playful of animals, but we are also the most sociable. We really depend upon other people. And one of the reasons we depend upon other people is we are the animal that depends more than any other animal on learning and knowledge. And how do we learn? We learn, unlike other animals that can only learn from their direct experience with the world around us, we can learn from other people. I don't have to have experienced everything, but if I can ask you, if you've done this, if you've been there or here, I could ask you what it's like there. And then no other animal could do that. It's amazing, and Piaget was wrong when he argued that little children can't learn through through hearing people explain things to them. Little children are fascinated by the explanations that they hear around them, and many little children, once they can ask questions, once they've got language, are asking questions constantly. They are plumbing other people's minds in order to learn what other people know. And so we come into the world designed to want to know what other people know. We don't have to impose it upon people. All we have to do is let them be free in a situation where they can overhear what other people are talking about. Kids learn a lot more just by overhearing adults talk or overhearing older kids talk than they learn from any kind of direct instruction. Because then, when they're overhearing it, they're the active ones. They're the ones wanting to get this. When direct instruction puts them in a kind of servile position, and it leads to the kind of a different attitude towards the whole thing. This is kind of being pushed upon me, as opposed to something, hey, this is really interesting that I'm kind of getting by eavesdropping on this conversation. Anthropologists who, one of my colleagues in a sense is David Lancy, who's written a book on the anthropology of childhood, and he argues that worldwide the primary way that people learn is by watching and listening. So kids are watching and listening to other people, and that's how they learn a huge amount of what they will ever know. Fourth drive that I've listed is willfulness. Children come into the world with a drive to take charge of their own lives. And in our culture, we've gone through a period of time when willfulness was sort of regarded as sinfulness. Fortunately, we're coming out of that horrible phase of history. But willfulness is really the drive to take charge of your own life. To be, we're social, we absolutely depend upon people, but also we have to be responsible for ourselves. We have to make our own decisions of how we're going to navigate this social world. And we can't allow ourselves, if we're going to kind of live the life that we are designed to live, we can't allow ourselves to be slaves to somebody else. And that even means we can't allow ourselves to be a slave to our parents. We can't allow ourselves to be a slave to a teacher. We naturally resist those things. that 2-year-old, those terrible twos, that they start saying no to everything. That's a positive thing, you know. And children, by the time they're 4, they want to get away. They want to go off and do their own thing, and with other children where there's nobody really with great power over them. They want to get away from power. They want to be in situations where they're in control. And you know, think about it. I think all of us, there's a certain aspect of being taught that, you know, like I've been in this situation many times where I'm using some new piece of equipment, and I know that my neighbor over there knows how to use this better than I do, but I don't want him to tell me. You know, you know, that sort of puts me in a subservient position. So I'll go out there when he's not around, and I'll operate my chainsaw or whatever it is. You know, I think we're all that way to some degree, and I think kids are very much that way. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later on. So that's willfulness. We want to be in charge of ourselves in our own life. We want to make our own mistakes. Even if we're going to make mistakes, we want to make them ourselves. Planfulness. You know, you wouldn't necessarily think of this as innate, but we are the animal that plans. We all plan. We can't help but plan. Children, you know, planfulness sort of grows in the sense that as children grow older, they plan in farther and farther ahead, and they think more and more consciously about planning. But little children in their play, you can't play without a plan. We're playing, you know, watch little children play, and they are setting it up. They're setting up a plan for how they're going to play. You're going to be a princess, and I'm going to be the queen, and so on and so forth, and we're laying out a plan, and then you follow the plan. Little kids may forget the plan and go on and do something else very quickly, but nevertheless they're creating a plan. You're building a sandcastle. You've got some image in your mind of what you're doing. You've got a plan to build this castle, and you're following through. So children are learning how to plan and to follow through on a plan when they're playing. As children get older, they begin to plan not just for the immediate, but maybe even for tomorrow. Okay, let's continue this game tomorrow. Let's meet here again and get this game going again tomorrow. Maybe they'll forget, but maybe they'll remember. And as they get older, they get better and better at making these plans and following through. And by the time they're 17, 18 years old, maybe they're even starting to plan, well, at some point I'm going to have to get out of my parents' house, and I'm going to have to make a living, and how might I do that? And my experience from studying people who are self-directed is they become pretty good at that. And they usually are even thinking about that well before 16 or 17 or 18 years old. So these are the characteristics. One of you know, this planfulness, the ability to kind of, a certain aspect of planfulness, the ability to plan a way of solving problems, to figure out an efficient way of solving a problem. Cognitive scientists call this self-directed executive functioning. It sounds like a fancy term. And they actually have developed a test of self-directed executive functioning. And there was a study done, published 3 years ago out of the University of Colorado at Boulder, in which they studied 6-year-olds and gave them this test of self-directed executive functioning, and about 100 6-year-olds. And they also interviewed the parents to find out how much time each of these children had for free play, undirected by adults. And what they found, no surprise to me, is that those children who had more free time away from adults, more time to just truly play and create their own activities, scored better on this test of self-directed executive functioning than those that did not. No surprise. If you have practice doing this, you will become good at it. If somebody else is always doing the planning for you, scheduling your day, telling you what you're supposed to do, and that you don't have responsibility for doing that for yourself, then you're not so likely to develop that ability. All right, I want to go on to C now. I'm probably going to have to speed up a little bit as I go through this. Self-directed education in hunter-gatherer bands. So some of the evidence that I've gathered that leads me to this hypothesis that we come into the world biologically designed to educate ourselves comes from a survey that a graduate student of mine and I did a number of years ago of anthropologists who have lived in hunter-gatherer bands. So, you know, we were all hunter-gatherers until a mere 10,000 or 11,000 years ago when agriculture first appeared. And as you probably know, there are some groups of hunter-gatherers who managed to survive as for pretty pristine hunter-gatherer cultures into at least the mid to late 20th century. I don't think there are any really pristine hunter-gatherer cultures today, although some will argue that they are. And there are certainly cultures that live by hunting and gathering, but they've been influenced to some degree at least by outside influences. But in the sort of mid 20th century was a big time for anthropologists to trek out to sort of isolated parts of Africa and Asia and South America, and to locate people who were still living the hunter-gatherer way of life. And what is fascinating is these people, there's a certain kind of similarity among all these people, regardless of where they're in, what climate they're living in, what they hunt, what they gather, and so on and so forth. They live in small bands of maybe 20 to 50 people per band, counting children. They move around to follow the available game and vegetation. And that means they don't own much property. There's no point in owning anything more than you can carry on your back. And they are also referred to by a term that's used for these band hunter-gatherer cultures that anthropologists use as egalitarian cultures, because they are by far the most egalitarian cultures that ever been found. They don't have chiefs, big men. They don't have leaders. They make their decisions by consensus. And so they are, and in fact, in such a band, for those bands who know about chiefs and so on, that to call somebody a chief is an insult. It means you think you're a big shot, don't you? Mm-hmm. And so any kind of bossing of somebody else is almost a taboo in such cultures. You just don't tell other people what to do. People pay attention, people cooperate, and so on and so forth, but not because anybody is telling them to. And what is fascinating to me is that this applies to children too. And at first I couldn't believe it. When one of my colleagues at Boston College, Gilda Morelli, is somebody who spent many months living with the FA, a hunter-gatherer group in Central Africa, around the 1970s and into the 80s. And she told me that they don't, that they just let children, that they don't boss children around, they don't criticize children, they don't praise children, because praise is also another way of trying to control. They just simply don't try to control their children. Well, first I thought, well, that's Gilda talking, that's her own particular perspective on it. But when we did this study and interviewed 10 other anthropologists, what we found is that all of them basically were saying that. And let me just read a couple of quotations to illustrate this. So this is from a researcher, an anthropologist who specializes in studying certain South American hunter-gatherer groups, but she's writing here about hunter-gatherers in general. Hunter-gatherers do not give orders to their children. For example, no adult announces bedtime. At night, children remain around adults until they feel tired and fall asleep. Adults do not interfere with their children's lives. They never beat, scold, or behave aggressively with them, physically or verbally, nor do they offer praise or keep track of their development. So here's another, this one isn't an anthropologist, this is actually Jean Laidlaw. Some of you probably know she wrote a book called The Continuum Concept. But as a young woman, she went off exploring in South America and got to know these people in the hunter-gatherer culture and wrote a book that has actually influenced parenting practices for a lot of people in our culture today. But she wrote, "The idea that this is my child or your child does not exist. Deciding what another person should do, no matter what his age, is outside the Equana vocabulary of behaviors. There is great interest in what everyone does, but no impulse to influence, let alone coerce. The child's will is his motive force." So, and this is what I heard all the time. Whereas we went through this horrid phase of history where willfulness was regarded as the devil getting into you, apparently, if these hunter-gatherers represent the way we live through most of our human history, we can't say that for sure, but given that this is true in all these different hunter-gatherer cultures that still exist, I think it's probably true. This means that willfulness was valued throughout most of human history, rather than something that was seen as something you have to fight against, that you have to try to control. So that was one of the lessons that came from this sort of look into hunter-gatherer way of life. One of the questions we asked of all of these anthropologists, who among them had lived in 7 different hunter-gatherer cultures in 3 different continents, another question we asked was, how much time did the children have to play, have free to play? And every one of them said essentially all the time. Some of them just said dawn to dusk. They were out there playing all day long. And even teenagers were. That surprised me. I thought kind of in these cultures you're an adult when you're a teenager, but no. You are still a kid. Even if you're married, you're still a kid. You become an adult maybe when you have your own kids. But you are out there from age 4 to sort of the mid to even late teens. You are one of the kids, and you are out there playing and exploring, in many cases away from adults, pretty much all day long. It doesn't mean you're always actively playing. You might be lounging around in a hammock. You might be strumming on a musical instrument. You might be, so the children are just allowed to be. But notice that they're in this age mixed setting. There's not a whole lot of children, so even if they wanted to segregate by age, they wouldn't have many who are the same age. So they're necessarily playing across ages. I'm going to argue that that's an important part of learning through play, is that you're playing with kids who are older and younger than you, and you are learning by virtue of observing the older children, by interacting with them. They're boosting you up to higher levels of activity. I would argue that in a hunter-gatherer culture, and certainly the anthropologists agreed with this, in a hunter-gatherer culture, the older children are your real teachers. And the younger children are, in a sense, your teachers too, because they're teaching you how to be nurturing and caring, and how to be responsible for other people as well as yourself. So, and that's the way I remember my childhood to a good degree. Back in the 1950s, school was not the big deal, and we didn't have all these adult-directed activities. So I argue that when I was a kid, I and most other kids back in the 1950s, we had 2 educations. We had school, but we spent much more time in what I call the hunter-gatherer education. We were out there playing and exploring, largely, often in age-mixed groups, almost always away from adults, practicing all kinds of activities that turned out to be very valuable as we went on in life. We weren't doing it because we thought they would be valuable later on in life. We were doing it because it was fun, thrilling, exciting. But that was the consequence. So the third thing that related to this is that I learned is, so we asked the anthropologists, what were they playing at? So they were playing, did you get a chance to see what they were playing at? And most of the anthropologists gave a list, and many of the things, when we looked at the list of what they saw kids playing at, many of the things mapped pretty well onto what are the important skills that you really have to learn in that culture to be successful. And so in cultures where men hunt, boys played endlessly at tracking game and at hunting. These are really difficult skills. Tracking game has been likened to being a scientist. You look at tiny little marks in the sand or a bent piece of grass, and from that you make inferences about what kind of animal it was, how fast it was moving, what time it went by, and so on and so forth. And children are practicing this. In the hunter-gatherer culture, there's no privacy because everybody can track you by just looking at your footprints. Everybody knows where everybody is, or at least they can find you. Well, little kids are tracking one another. They're learning that skill. They're learning a lot about animals. They play games of mimicking animals. So they're practicing the skills. In the one culture where women also hunted, the girls also played endlessly at tracking and hunting. So it's not it depends upon what it is that you see the adults of your sex doing. Most of the play was both boys and girls, because most of the activities, other than hunting, and for example, gathering, men and women gather in almost all of these cultures. And so being able to locate roots, being able to use digging sticks and so on and so forth. Cooking is something that both boys and girls do. In some cultures, women do more fishing than the men, and the girls played at fishing more than the boys did. So that you could more or less predict what they would play at. They played musical instruments. They played at the dances. They played at dancing, the traditional dances of the culture, but they would also make up their own dances. They played at arguing, which a couple of the anthropologists pointed out. Kids would sit, so I mean, think of this as a culture where decisions are made by consensus. So if you want to have influence, you better be pretty good at getting your point across in a way that doesn't antagonize other people and so on. And so one anthropologist pointed out that he would observe these children. They would build a little play village far enough away that was out of earshot of the set of huts that was the main temporary campsite of the group. And they would reenact the arguments that they heard around the campfire the previous night. And if some adult was particularly bad at arguing, they would exaggerate how bad he was. And pretty soon they'd all be laughing and rolling on the floor about this stupid adult who was... So they're playing, it's a nice example also because it shows that children learn not only from the good examples, they learn from the bad examples around them. And especially when they're in this kind of a setting, when they can discuss these bad examples with one another and analyze them. Little kids, they're kind of like scientists, they're studying the adults to figure out which adults out there are the ones I would really like to be like, or what aspect of that adult would I like to be like, and which one should I? Oh God, that's not something I want to do when I grow up. So that was my that was our little study of hunter-gatherers. So now, what happened? Why did we go from hundreds of thousands of years, if this is all true, about if really during, I don't want to make the case that all hunter-gatherers were like this. I think that all hunter-gatherers were like this in the sense that there was never any schools or teaching. But I don't want to make the case that all hunter-gatherers were as peaceful and egalitarian as the hunter-gatherers that have been studied in recent times. Most anthropologists, archaeologists think that a large number of them were. But some of them may have been more like farming communities where they're defending areas that have a lot rich fishing grounds and so on and so forth. And some of them had pretty awful rituals and so on. So I don't want to over-romanticize the hunter-gatherer way of life. But these groups that have been studied, they all seem to be peaceful. They all seem to not entirely peaceful. I mean, people get angry, but they never condone violence. They don't condone violence, unlike the tribal agricultural societies that followed them, where it's almost your obligation to be violent. So if somebody offends you, you're supposed to kill them. Somebody kills your relative, you're supposed to kill one of their relatives. The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth idea that came around as a result of, that doesn't seem to exist in these band hunter-gatherer cultures. So what happened? Why did we go from that to something where willfulness was no longer valued, where we felt we had to control children? And here's the story that I think makes a lot of sense. What really happened was agriculture. When agriculture came around, then people began to own property. You can't just grow stuff and just let anybody come and take it. If you've put all the work into cultivating and planting, and you can't just let other people come in and take it. So now you kind of have to defend this area that you planted. This is now your property. This idea of property came about. And as soon as you've got property, so for a while this may be okay. Maybe there's enough land, everybody's got property, but there's only a certain amount of property that's good for farming. Pretty soon it gets all used up, at least in this local area. So now there's some people who have property and some who don't. And the people who don't have property are now dependent on the people who do have property. And this, as time developed, this evolved eventually into feudalism, right? Where basically, at least legally, all the property was owned by just a few lords and masters. And everybody else, in some sense, was a servant. Everybody else was a serf or a slave or a servant. So we entered a world, with the advent of property, we entered a world in which most people were going to be servants to other people. And if you are a servant, you can't have free will. You can't have, because free will is dangerous. If you spout your mouth off to the Lord, you might be killed. If you say, no, that doesn't make any sense, I'm not going to do that, you can't use, you have to give up the power of free thought if you're going to be a servant in those settings. You have to just do what you're told to do. Child rearing then changed. The goal of child rearing became to suppress free will, to produce obedience. Think of, I don't know how many of you ever looked at the Bible for parenting advice, but if you look at the Bible for parenting advice, the Bible has some good things in it, but don't look at it for parenting advice. The Bible is all about, in fact, let me just read a couple of quotations. I've tried to sort of look at what does the Bible tell us about parenting? So here's one, Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. That's the most moderate statement. Here's a more extreme one. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, who doesn't have a stubborn and rebellious son, who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders of the gate of his town. Then all the men of his town shall stone him to death. Right? So this is the kind of advice. This was serious in those days. Not that I think most parents didn't actually do that, but they wanted to make sure that, but beating children was routine. In fact, beating was almost a synonym for education. To educate a child really meant to beat a child, to beat the free will out of the child. So, and it's not just the Old Testament. Here's Matthew 15:4. For God commanded, saying, honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father and mother shall be put to death. This is pretty extreme. But remember, this is the world that the people who wrote this were in. This is a world in which if you didn't train your child to be obedient, if you didn't train your child to be subservient, your child would be at great risk not to be able to survive. And so we have to kind of be understanding of that situation. These were not terrible parents, and maybe this wasn't even terrible advice. I mean, the part about killing the child was terrible advice, but the part about threatening the child, we're going to kill you if you do this, maybe wasn't so terrible advice, right? So from our perspective today, fortunately we're coming out of this. We're no longer raising our children to be servants and slaves, and at least to the degree that we used to. We now kind of are beginning again to value willfulness. We're bringing this back again. But the point I want to make is that schools arose in that environment. That was the context in which the kinds of schools that became the predecessors of our modern day schools were developed. It was really the Protestant Reformation that brought schooling to the world, to Europe and to the colonies. So the first schools there were always to some degree schools, but they were a lot of different kinds of schools, and they tended to be for rich people, and they were sort of like tutors and that kind of thing. But the first schools that were kind of for the masses were religious Protestant schools. And the Protestants, unlike the Catholics, believed that it was important for people to read the Bible themselves. And so therefore it was important that people know how to read. But even more important than reading the Bible is, of course, believing the Bible. So, and also this idea, which was, the Protestants were not, although they rebelled against the Pope, they really, like everybody else, they believed in obedience. Obedience to lords and masters, to the leaders of the church, obedience to your parents. So the Protestant schools were developed very clearly for three purposes. Teaching reading, which turned out not really to be the major purpose, because even in the colonies, most kids already knew how to read. And there was more concern with what they were reading than with the ability to read. Even, I mean, there's actually evidence. Reading, it turns out, you don't really need a lot of schooling to learn how to read. There's data that shows, I mean, it was illegal to teach slaves to read, and yet a lot of slaves could read. They snuck it. They learned how to read. You know, it's not that hard. I could, you know, sometimes I've done some research on learning how to read. There are 3-year-olds who learn how to read. You know, if a 3-year-old can do it, how hard can it be? You know, it's really just a matter of wanting to do it and getting engaged in doing it. So the real lessons of these schools were obedience and indoctrination. And so the method of schooling was recitation. You would be given what you're supposed to feed back. You would be given things to memorize and feed it back. And in those days, of course, it was largely biblical quotations. The first schools in the United States, the first compulsory schools in the United States were in the colony of Massachusetts. Massachusetts, my home state, has always been first in education. And so these were they used beginning in 1642. Massachusetts mandated at least some degree of schooling, and it was religiously controlled schooling. The primer that children learned from is colloquially called the Little Bible of New England. And it was all about obedience. It was all about the threat of hell if you don't obey. So there would be children who have to memorize and feed back little ditties, little rhymes about how if they lie to their parents, they'll spend eternity burning in hell. They learned their ABCs. A is for apple, and then the following sentence is, in Adam's fall we sinned all, right? And then it goes on to Z, Zachary climbed the tree his Lord to see. And so this was what children learned from. And the schooling was developed especially fully in Prussia, beginning in the late 17th century and into the 18th century. And it was the Pietist sect of Protestantism that headed the schools there. And if there's one person that could be called sort of the father of our modern day schooling, it is August Hermann Francke, who sort of was the head of the Prussian schools. And he developed a system of schooling, of accreditation of teachers, of graded schooling, so children were going through certain consistent steps, of timed lessons. It would be an hourglass in front of the room, so that every hour you would go to a new kind of lesson, and so on and so forth. But it was all the lessons really had to do with biblical doctrine. And here's what Francke wrote about this, in his manual to schoolmasters. Above all, it is necessary to break the natural willfulness of the child, while the schoolmaster who seeks to make the child more learned, and by more learned means know more of the Bible, more learned is to be commended. He has not done enough. He has forgotten his most important task, namely that of making the will obedient. And then he went on, elsewhere he wrote, youth do not know how to regulate their lives and are naturally inclined toward idle and sinful behavior when left to their own devices. For this reason, it is a rule in this institution that a pupil never be allowed out of the presence of the supervisor. The supervisor's presence will stifle the pupil's inclination to sinful behavior and slowly weaken his willfulness. Well, that was the kind of message that basically all of these schools had. Now, as the power of religion declined and the power of states increased, these same schools were taken over by states. And now the lessons were no longer so much religious lessons, they were now largely patriotic lessons. They were lessons aimed at teaching children to believe that their native, their country, their leaders, they are better than anybody else. Napoleon really gravitated to this. Schools were to him the place you train little soldiers. You put people in the kind of mindset to become a soldier. So schools gradually took over, and then over time,
schools changed in certain ways. The curriculum expanded, began to teach a lot of different things. No longer, to a large extent, although still in the United States, I don't know about here in Texas, there are still cases of beating children in school, or at least corporal punishment in school, but we've pretty much done away with that. And we use shaming instead. We use psychological means of punishing instead of physical means of punishing as a way of controlling children's behavior. We use comparison. We use this implicit statement, you're not as good as these other people who all got A's and you only got a C, or so on and so on. We use all that kind of thing instead. And we believe that's more, that is more humane than hitting children. I'm not sure that it is, but at least it feels to us that it's more humane. So those are the ways we've changed, but in certain ways we've not changed. We still have this school setting that children are sitting in rows, they are being given lessons, and their job is to feed back those lessons. Even though most people who go into teaching don't articulate, the reason I'm going into teaching is I want to teach children to obey. Yet, the real lesson of school is always obedience. Think of it. The only way you can fail in school, is not to do what you're told to do, right? As long as you do what you're told to do, you will pass. You might not get an A, but you will pass. If you don't do what you're told to do, you will surely fail. So ultimately, the lesson is obedience. Ultimately, it is the willingness blindly, even if it doesn't make sense to you, to do what the teacher is telling you to do. That's the real message of school. Years ago, that was explicit. That was supposed to be the message. That was supposed to be what you're doing. Now we don't think of it that way. We even talk about, we're trying to produce creative thinkers and critical thinkers and so on and so forth. But we're stuck with the method of schooling that was designed for indoctrination and obedience training. And you simply can't, unless you overthrow that entire method, start really new, you can't use that old system in order to produce creative thinkers and critical thinkers and innovators. You just can't do it. You can't have 20 or 30 kids in a room who are all supposed to pass the same test and expect that you're going to be able to do that without using force of some kind, reward or punishment, to get them all to study that. There's no way that everybody's natural curiosity is going to be attuned to the same thing at the same time. So the setting that we have was designed to inculcate certain messages in children that they believed all children have to learn, and to inculcate this obedience, this blind obedience. And we still have that system. And my argument is you can't use that system in order to produce creative thinkers. In order to, you can play with the system. So progressive educators try to play with that system. They try to push it a little bit one way or the other. But then the push always goes back the other way, because ultimately you're still testing the kids. You're still evaluating the kids in some sense. You still get nervous. Some kids haven't learned to read when they're 6 or 7, and everybody gets nervous about that, and then you start having to teach reading, and then this whole idea that there's some freedom involved goes out the window, and you push back to a more direct instruction kind of approach and more coercion. So what would happen if you just overthrow the system? What would happen if you just start with an entirely different kind of school? And what happens is a place like Abrome, a place like Clearview, a place like Sudbury Valley School, where this is not a fiddling with the system that Frankie created. This is an entirely different kind of setting. And what I think it is I think it's a setting that is designed to be, for our time and place, what a hunter-gatherer band is for children in a hunter-gatherer group. A place where children are free to play and explore, to pursue their own interests, to play with the tools of the culture, to interact with other people, to learn by observing, to use all those natural drives that they have, and where they develop the confidence that they can use them, and nobody tries to talk them out of using it. Nobody tries to convince them that you will become educated if you do the things that I'm telling you to do. Where we just simply trust their natural instincts to learn. So that's the kind of setting that I got involved in, I got interested in many years ago when my own son was rebelling in public school. And he went ultimately to the Sudbury Valley School, which is a school in Framingham, Massachusetts. And I was skeptical. I, in some sense, was intrigued. I could see that my son, who was 10 by the time he started there, was happy. He believed this was what a school should be. He was allowed to just play and explore all day long, do what he wanted to do. There were rules in the school, a lot of rules in the school, but they were all made democratically. So he and everybody else had to vote on the rules, and they were enforced democratically. No hierarchy of structure in the sense that there's some authority figure that can arbitrarily stop you from doing something or make you do something. There's rules, but you've created the rules. And to him, to my son at the age of 10, this was exactly what a school should be. This was exactly the opposite of the situation which he was in, which he articulated was a prison. To him, the school he was going to, which was by all reports a good suburban school, was a prison. And I finally come around to believing, it took me a long time, that it was a prison. And that all of these schools are prisons. And that it, to me, it's become a civil rights issue to get kids out of these prisons. Because once you realize it's not necessary, once you realize that children can educate themselves using their own joyful natural means, then how can you justify depriving children of the civil rights, putting them in a situation that no adult would stand for? A situation where you are really micromanaged all day long, where you're told exactly what you've got to do, where you have to get permission to go to the bathroom, you're not allowed to talk to your neighbor next to you. Cooperation is regarded as cheating. All these things. Who would accept a job that was like that, right? And yet we put our children in that setting, and we think it's good for them, right? And we consider ourselves to be a democracy. And schools, if you think about it, are the least democratic institutions we have. They're the most autocratic institutions that we have. How are we training children? I mean, no wonder so many people grow up feeling kind of cynical about democracy. Oh yeah, it's a free world, right? You know. So those are the kinds of thoughts that went into the creation of Sudbury Valley. Well, at that time, and it was to some degree an experiment. When this school first started in 1968, it's almost now 50 years old. It's now got a long history, and I did a study of the graduates many years ago of the school. And what that study convinced me is that the school works. The graduates were educated, including those who had done all of what elsewhere would be their K through 12 education. By any reasonable criterion, they were well educated. Those who wanted to go to higher education didn't seem to have any difficulty doing it. They went on even to prestigious colleges. Kids who had never, you know how these colleges say you've got to take certain required courses to get in? Here's kids who hadn't taken a course. They'd never taken a course, never read a textbook, never took a test until they took the SAT test, which if they went to a more elite college, they would have to take. So they studied for the SAT test. Turns out it's not that hard to study for. And they got in, you know, and I ended up feeling, and some of them admitted, they felt actually they were advantaged compared to others. Because think of it, especially you're applying to a relatively elite college. So people who have, you know, 4.0 grade point averages, who've done all the right volunteer activities and all the correct extracurricular activities, all the applicants are like that, right? So, you know, so you're kind of making fine choices. And I could imagine, I've never been on an admissions committee at a university, but I could imagine you get kind of bored with that. And then you pick this one who says, well, I've never actually been to school. I haven't taken any courses. But let me tell you why I think that I am the right student. I think this is the right college for me. And they go on and write an essay about that, and they maybe include some kind of a portfolio of things that they've done, depending on what area they're in, essays they've written, and so on and so forth. And what happens is they're very likely to get invited to an interview, because if, you know, in all good conscience, they can't just, the admissions personnel can't just throw this away. So what are we going to do? So, well, let's invite them over and talk with them. And so these people are good at being interviewed. They're not afraid of adults. They have given a lot of thought. They're not going to college. Most people who go to college are going to college because they think they have to go to college. Just like 13th grade is first year of college, right? And so they have that same attitude about it. There's nothing special about this. But the kids who go from a self-directed learning to college, they don't feel like they have to go to college. They certainly don't feel like they have to go to college to learn, but they've made a reasoned decision to go to college. They want to go into a career that requires college, at least the way society is structured now, or if they have some other reason why they want to pursue some area with experts, and so they are able to make a good case for why they want to be there. The case that the more typical student who's applying can't make because they aren't authentic about it. So that study showed me that the school works, and then in subsequent research, we found that we did research on how it works. I'm going to be talking much more about that at Clearview in a couple days from now. I want to sort of bring this. I realize that we're already at 8:30. I want to kind of go through point G here. We can have some time for discussion and questions, people who want to stay around. But I want to say now why I think this idea, I mean, Sudbury Valley has been around for 50 years. Summerhill, which was really in some sense the original school for self-directed education, has been around for almost 100 years. So the idea is not new. There's graduates even of Summerhill going way back. We know it works. This is not a new idea, but it has not taken off. It hasn't caught on. I think it's beginning to catch on, and I think it's going to catch on in the future. And the reason I believe so has to do with, and we're on G on this handout, there are 4 reasons why I think that now is the time for self-directed education to take off. The first reason is the increased toxicity of standard imposed schooling. School is worse today than it's ever been. It's even worse than when Frankie had his schools. And the reason it's worse is because there's more of it. It's not that their methods are worse today, it's that there's more of it. Back in those days, you went to school a few weeks a year or a few months a year, but most of your life was out of school. And so you still had lots of time for self-directed education. School is usurping more and more of children's time, more and more of families' time. It's encroaching on families. Parents are expected to be assistant teachers at home, so school doesn't end when you come home. You're now doing homework. And out of school, because we've developed sort of this schoolish mentality of child raising, that children are going to learn only if there's some adult there teaching them stuff. So now even when they're not in school, we put them in adult-directed things, adult-directed sports instead of just sending them out of the house to make their own games. We put them in karate classes and Chinese calligraphy classes and who knows what else. So they're taking all these, they're in school, many children are basically in school all the time. And so, and we are seeing the consequences of that. And I'll get to that in a moment. So school, you know, every bureau, every institution has the desire, the sort of innate desire to grow. It's sort of a natural thing. You get as big and powerful as you can. And our schooling system has done that. Over time, it's exerted, there's more money being spent on it. It's taking more children's time. Children start school earlier. The age that you can leave school gets later. The school year gets longer. The school year, I actually looked this up, the average school year when I was a kid was 5 weeks shorter than it is today. So we've taken a full month away from summer vacation and a week from vacation during the school year. Homework didn't exist in the 1950s for elementary school kids. Once in a while, a teacher might ask us to write a poem or a story or paint a picture at home and bring it in because that would be fun. But we never carried worksheets back and forth or books back and forth to school in elementary school. So over time, school has become usurped more and more of children's and families' time. And it's getting to the point where parents are recognizing this is interfering with the family and this is harming my child because my child doesn't have any time to do the things that my child wants to do. And that's leading people to take their kids out of school. It's one of the reasons homeschooling is increasing fairly rapidly. So that's one reason. There's also the other evidence of the toxicity is children today are more depressed, more anxious. The suicide rate is higher than it's ever been before in recorded American history. Much higher. The suicide rate for children under age 15 is now 6 times what it was in the 1950s. And it's, as school has become more and more oppressive, the suicide rate continues to increase. Survey done by the American Psychological Association a couple of years ago determined that the most anxious people in America are teenagers, middle school and high school kids, and 83% of them cite school as the source of their anxiety. I tried to do some digging into emergency mental health intakes, the kind of situation where usually the child is suicidal and you take them in emergency. Suicides, the emergency mental health intakes skyrocket during the school year and plummet during the summer. So there's the relationship is absolutely clear. School is driving a lot of kids crazy. It literally is driving a lot of kids crazy. We are more and more diagnosing kids. Instead of saying the school is a harmful environment, we're saying this child has some kind of a mental disorder. We're even calling school refusal a mental disorder, right? ADHD, which was just sort of normal behavior, especially normal boy behavior. Something like 20% of boys are getting a diagnosis of ADHD, and many of them are taking powerful drugs. This is finally, people are becoming aware, hey, this is not right. This is not right. This can't be a problem. It can't be that so many boys, because boys are suffering more even than girls, and not to say the girls aren't suffering, but the boys' suffering is in some sense more obvious. But it can't be that this many boys are born with some kind of an abnormality. This has got to be something about school that's producing this. And it produces it in some people. Some people are more vulnerable than others. Some people require more self-direction than others. Some people are more adaptable. They're willing to kind of go along with whatever happens to them in their life. And that may be a good thing or maybe a bad thing. I tend to think that it's often a bad thing, you know, that you become kind of a sheep. And the sheep do okay in school. So that's one thing that's happening. The other thing is that the second point is the increased evidence that self-directed education works. We now have more and more people who've done it. It's easy to point to people, successful people, in all kinds of careers. No longer is it justifiable to say I'm taking just a huge risk by allowing my child to take control of his own education. There's no evidence. The evidence, I would argue, is you're taking a bigger risk by not, because the risk of suicide, the risk of these things happening if you force your child to be in a school, especially if your child is not adapting to that, that's the bigger risk, in my opinion. We now have so much evidence. It used to be that people would say, when they would hear about Sudbury Valley and its graduates, they would say, oh, well, I suppose there are certain very self-directed kids, and that's probably just these self-directed kids who are there and they're doing well, but my kid would never do that. My kid would never have that kind of stuff, wouldn't do anything if in that sort of situation. Well, what 3-year-old is not self-directed? So if your kid is not doing anything, why? What has caused that? And I would argue that the kid, in many of these cases, the kid is being burned out by school. And so that's a lot. So there's more evidence that it works. The third point I've listed here is the increased ease of pursuing self-directed education. It's never been easier in the history of humanity to educate yourself, partly because of the internet. You know, any kid knows they don't have to carry a lot of facts around in their mind. They can look things up. They can explore. They can. You don't have to go to school to find an expert on something. You can go online and find an expert. You can find people doing YouTubes on whatever it is that you're interested in, and you can look at several different people and different ways of doing it. You can learn. I know kids who learn foreign languages by playing video games in a foreign language, and they learn the foreign language. It's almost as good as going and living in that foreign country, because you're basically interacting with that foreign language in the game. There's so much, and moreover, as self-directed education becomes more acceptable, as more and more people doing it, it's easier to do it because you're not violating a norm to the degree that you were before. It's more, that's part of why we want to sort of normalize self-directed education, get this term out there. And the fourth reason that I've listed is the fit of self-directed education with the modern economy. An argument could be made that back in the days when we had factories and large numbers of people worked in factories, that there was a certain sense in which school did prepare you for work life. It prepared you to be able to do tedious work for many hours, taught you to be on time, to be timely, you had to be on time, taught you to follow directions. And taught you to be able to memorize a lot of information and to sort of be willing to sort of do routine work that's expected of you. But we no longer live in that world. We now live in a world where you don't need to memorize a lot. We don't need people who can memorize a lot of information. We've got Google for that, right? We don't need people who can feed back information. And we don't need people who are willing and able to do routine, boring, tedious tasks over and over. We've got robots for that. So what do we need? We need people who can ask questions that nobody else thought of asking and who can find answers to them that nobody else thought of finding answers. We need people who can bring a moral perspective to the environment because the machines don't have morality. We need people who know how to socialize with other people, who know how to work as a team, how to get a group of people to work as a team. These are the kinds of people that the businesses are crying out for. And they're not finding enough of them because we're not training that. We need people who are creative. We need, as the economy has demanded more and more initiative, creativity, self-starting, willingness to learn on the job, because you're not going to be able to, whatever you know today is going to be obsolete 3 or 4 years from now. You've got to be constantly able and interested in learning. These are exactly the kinds of things that self-directed learners are practicing all the time as they're growing up. They are, in a sense, learning the kinds of skills that our modern economy is demanding. And that's why it's not surprising to me that in my studies of grown unschoolers and of my studies of grown Sudbury Valley students, that they do pretty well in this economy. Many of them are entrepreneurs, they are creative, they start their own businesses, and they treasure the idea that they aren't going to necessarily do the same job their whole life. They like the idea of exploring new things all the time. So that's, I think for those reasons, as people catch on to this, I think there's going to be first the continuation of a gradual increase, but then I think we'll reach a point, maybe where 10%, maybe where 15% of people are involved in self-directed education. We'll reach a point where everybody knows somebody who's doing it, and everybody can see it's working out okay. And the history of humanity has been, generally speaking, that when freedom is seen as a choice, when we see that freedom works, we choose freedom. And so I think when we see that freedom works for children's education, we will choose it. But we have to be convinced that it works. And I think that convincing that it works is what's happening now and what is going to happen when more and more people do it. So let me close now, and thank you very, very much for your time and attention.